The beans were like bullets, the corn tough. Outside, the prevailing wind snuffed and whined around the ground-level eaves. The gunslinger ate quickly, ravenously, drinking 4 cups of water with the meal. Halfway through, there was a machine gun rapping at the door. Brown got up and let Zoltan in. The bird flew across the room and hunched moodily in the corner. "Musical fruit," he muttered. "You ever think about eating him?" the gunslinger asked. The dweller laughed. "Animals that talk be tough," he said. "Birds, billy-bumbers, human beings, they be tough eatin'." After dinner, the gunslinger offered his tobacco. The dweller, Brown, accepted eagerly. Now, the gunslinger thought, now the questions will come. But Brown asked no questions. He smoked the tobacco that had been grown in Garland years before and looked at the dying embers of the fire. It was already noticeably cooler in the hovel. "Lead us not in temptation," Zoltan said suddenly, apocalyptically. The gunslinger started as if he had been shot at. He was suddenly sure that all of this was an illusion, that the man in black had spun a spell and was trying to tell him something in a maddening, obtuse, symbolic way. "Do you know Tull?" he suddenly asked. Brown nodded. "Came through it to get here. Went back once to sell corn and drink a glass of whiskey. It rained that year. Lasted maybe 15 minutes. The ground just seemed to open up and suck it up. An hour later was just as wide and dry as ever, but the corn, oh God, the corn, you could see it grow. That wasn't so bad, but you could hear it, as if the rain had given it a mouth. It wasn't a happy sound. It seemed to be sighing and growing and groaning its way out of the earth." He paused. "I had extra, so I took it and sold it. Papa Doc said he'd do it too, but he would have had to cheated me, so I went." "You don't like town?" "No." "I almost got killed there," the gunslinger said. "Do you say so?" "Said my watch and warrant on it. And I killed a man that was touched by God," the gunslinger said. "Only it wasn't God. It was the man with the rabbit up his sleeve. The man in black." "You laid a trap." "You say true, I say thank you." They looked at each other across the shadows, the moment taking an overtone of finality. Now the questions will come. But Brown still had no questions to ask. His cigarette was down to a smoldering roach, but when the gunslinger tapped his poke, Brown shook his head. Zoltan shifted restlessly, seemed about to speak, but subsided. "Will I tell you about it?" the gunslinger asked. "Ordinarily, I'm not so much of a talker, but sometimes talking helps. I'll listen." The gunslinger searched for words to begin with and found none. "I have to pass water," he said. Brown nodded. "Pass it to the corn, please." "Sure." He went up the stairs and out into the dark. The stars glittered overhead, the wind pulsed. His urine arched out over the powdery cornfield in a wavering steam. The man in black had drawn him here. It wasn't beyond the possibility that Brown was the man in black. He might be. The gunslinger shut these useless and upsetting thoughts away. The only contingency he had not learned how to bear with was the possibility of his own madness. He went back inside. "Have you decided if I'm an enchantment yet?" Brown asked, amused. The gunslinger paused on a tiny landing, startled. Then he came down slowly and sat. "The thought had crossed my mind." "Are you?" "If I am, I don't know it." This wasn't a terribly helpful answer, but the gunslinger decided to let it pass. "I started to tell you about Tull." "Is it growing?" "It's dead," the gunslinger said. "I killed it." He thought of adding, "And now I'm going to kill you, if for no other reason that I don't want to sleep with one eye open." But had he come to such behavior? If so, why bother to go on at all? Why, if he had become what he had pursued? Brown said, "I don't want nothing from you, gunslinger, except to still be here when you move on. I won't beg for my life, but that don't mean I don't want it yet a while longer." The gunslinger closed his eyes, his mind whirled. "Tell me what you are," he said thickly. "Just a man. One who means you no harm, and I'm still willing to listen if you're willing to talk." To this, the gunslinger made no reply. "I guess you won't feel right about it unless I invite you," Brown said. "And so I do. Will you tell me about Tull?" The gunslinger was surprised to find that this time words were there. He began to speak in flat bursts that slowly spread into an even, slightly toneless narrative. He found himself oddly excited. He talked deep into the night. Brown did not interrupt at all. Neither did the bird. 5. He bought the mule in Princetown, and when he reached Tull, it was still fresh. The sun had set an hour earlier, but the gunslinger had continued traveling, guided by the town's glow in the sky. Then, by the uncannily clear notes of a honky-tonk piano playing "Hey Jude," the road whined as it took on tributaries. Here there were overhead sparklights, all of them long dead. The forests were long gone now, replaced by the monotonous flat prairie country, endless, desolate fields gone to timothy and low shrubs, eerie, deserted estates guarded by brooding, shadowed mansions where demons undeniably walked, leering empty shanties where the people had either moved on or had been moved along. On occasion dwellers hovel, given away by a single flickering point of light in the dark, or by sullen, inbred can-fams toiling silently in the fields by day. Corn was the main crop, but there were beans and also some pokeberries. An occasional scrawny cow stared at them lumpishly from between peeled alder poles. Coaches had passed him 4 times, twice coming and twice going, nearly empty as they came up from behind and bypassed him and his mule, fuller as they headed back towards forests of the north. Now and then a farmer passed with his feet up on the splashboard of his bucka, careful not to look at the man with the guns. It was ugly country. It had showed twice since he had left Princetown, grudgingly both times. Even the timothy looked yellow and dispirited. Pass on by country. He had seen no sign of the man in black. Perhaps he had taken a coach. The road made a bend, and beyond it the gunslinger clucked to the mule to stop and looked down at Tull. It was at the floor of a circular, bowl-shaped hollow, a shoddy jewel in a cheap setting. There was a number of lights, most of them clustered around the area of the music. There looked to be 4 streets, 3 running at right angles to the coach road, which was the main avenue of the town. Perhaps there would be a cafe. He doubted it, but perhaps. He clucked at the mule. More houses sporadically lined the road now, most of them still deserted. He passed a tiny graveyard with moldy, leaning wooden slabs overgrown and choked by the rank devil grass. Perhaps 500 feet further on the path a chewed sign which said Tull. The paint was flaked almost to the point of illegibility. There was another further on, but the gunslinger was not able to read that one at all. A fool's chorus of half-stoned voices was rising in the final protracted lyric of Hey Jude. Na 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 na, na 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 na, Hey Jude, as he entered the town proper. It was a dead sound, like the wind in the hollow of a rotted tree, only the prosaic thump and pound of the honky-tonk piano saved him from seriously wondering if the man in black might not have raised ghosts to inhabit the deserted town. He smiled a little at the thought. There were people on the streets, but not many. There were ladies wearing black slacks and identical high-collared blouses passed by on the opposite boardwalk, not looking at him with pointed curiosity. Their faces seemed to swim above their all but invisible bodies like pallid balls with eyes. A solemn old man with a straw hat perched firmly on the top of his head watched him from the steps of a boarded-up mercantile store. A scrawny tailor with a late customer paused to watch him go by. He held up the lamp in his window for a better look. The gunslinger nodded. Neither the tailor nor his customer nodded back. He could feel their eyes resting heavily upon the low-slung holsters that lay against his hips. A young boy, perhaps 13, and a girl who might have been his sissa or his jilly child, crossed the street a block up, pausing imperceptibly. Their footfalls raised little hanging clouds of dust. Here, in a town, most of the street side lamps worked, but they weren't electric. Their isinglass sides were cloudy with congealed oil. Some had been crashed out. There was a livery with a just hanging on look to it, probably depending on the coach line for its survival. 3 boys crouched silently around a marble ring drawn in the dust to one side of the barn, gaping's maw, smoking cornhusk cigarettes. They made long shadows in the yard. One had a scorpion's tail poked in the band of his hat. Another had a bloated left eye bulging sightlessly from its socket. The gunslinger led his mule past them and looked into the dim deeps of the barn. One lamp glowed sullenly. A shadow jumped and flickered as a gangling old man in bib overalls forked loose Timothy Hay into the hayloft with a big grunting sweeps of his fork. "Hey," the gunslinger called. The fork faltered and the holster looked around with yellow-tinged eyes. "Hey yourself!" "I got a mule here." "Good for you!" The gunslinger flicked a heavy, unevenly mild gold piece into the semi-dark. It rang on the old chaff-drifted boards. The holster came forward, bent, picked it up, squinted at the gunslinger. His eyes dropped to the gun belts, and he nodded sourly. "How long do you want him put up here?" "A night or 2, maybe longer." "I ain't got no change for gold." "Didn't ask for any." "Shut up money," the holster muttered. "What did you say?" "Nothing, nothing." The holster caught the mule's bridle and led him inside. "Rub him down," the gunslinger called. "I expect to smell it on him when I come back. Hear me well." The old man did not turn. The gunslinger walked out to the boys crouched around the marble ring. They had watched the entire exchange with contemptuous interest. "Long days and pleasant nights," the gunslinger offers conversationally. No answer. "You fellas live in town?" No answer, lest the scorpion's tail gave one. It seemed to nod. One of the boys removed a crazily tilted twist of corn husk from his mouth, grasped a green cat's eye marble, and squirted it into the dark circle. It struck a croaker and knocked it outside. He picked up the cat's eye and prepared to shoot again. "There's a cafe in town?" the gunslinger asked. One of them looked up, the youngest. There was a huge cold sore at the corner of his mouth, but his eyes were both the same size, and full of innocence that wouldn't have lasted long in this shithole. He looked at the gunslinger with a hooded, brimmed wonder that was touching and frightening. "Might get a burger at Sheb's." "That the honky-tonk?" The boy nodded. "Yar." The eyes of his mates had turned ugly and hostile. He would probably pay for have spoken up in kindness. The gunslinger touched the brim of his hat. "I'm grateful. It's good to know that someone in this town is bright enough to talk." He walked past, mounted the boardwalk, and started down towards Sheb's. Hearing the clear, contemptuous voice of one of the others, hardly more than a child's treble, "Weed eater! How long have you been screwing your sister, Charlie? Weed eater!" Then the sound of a blow and a cry. There were 3 flaring kerosene lamps in front of Sheb's, one to each side, and one nailed above the drunk batwing doors. The chorus of "Hey Jude" had petered out, and the piano was plinking some other old ballad. Voices murmured in the broken threads. The gunslinger paused outside for a moment, looking in. Sawdust floors, spittoons by the tipsy ledge tables. A plank bar on sawhorses. A gummy mirror behind it, reflecting the piano player who wore an inevitably piano stool slouch. The front of the piano had been removed, so you could watch the wooden keys wonk up and down as the contraption was played. The bartender was a straw-haired woman wearing a dirty blue dress. One strap was held with a safety pin. There were perhaps 6 townies in the back of the room, juicing and playing Watch Me apathetically. Another half-dozen were grouped loosely about the piano, 4 or 5 at the bar, and an old woman with wild grey hair collapsed at the table by the doors. The gunslinger went in. Head swiveled to look at him and his guns. There was a moment of near silence except for the obvious piano player, who continued to tinkle. Then the woman mopped at the bar, and the things shifted back. "Watch me!" one of the players in the corner said, and matched 3 hearts with 4 spades, emptying his hands. The one with the heart swore, pushing over his stake, and the next hand was dealt. The gunslinger approached the woman at the bar. "You got meat?" he asked. "Sure." She looked at him in his eye, and she might have been pretty when she started out, but the world had moved on since then. Now her face was lumpy, and there was a livid scar went screwing across her forehead. She had powdered it heavily, and the powder called attention to what it had meant to camouflage. "Clean beef, threaded stock. It's dear, though." "Threaded stock my ass," the gunslinger thought. "What you got in your cooler come from something with 3 eyes, 6 legs, or both. That's my guess, Lady Sigh." "I want 3 burgers and a beer, would it please ya?" Again, and that subtle shift in tone. 3 hamburgers, mouth watered and tongues licked at saliva with slow lust. 3 hamburgers. Had anyone here ever seen anyone eating 3 hamburgers at a go? "That will give you $5. Do you ken box?" "Dollars." She nodded, so she was probably saying bucks. That was his guess, anyway. That with the beer?" he asked, smiling a little. "Or is the beer extra?" She didn't return the smile. "I'll throw in the suds, once I see the color of your money, that is." The gunslinger put a gold piece on the bar, and every eye followed it. There was a smoldering charcoal cooker behind the bar and to the left of the mirror. The woman disappeared into a small room behind it and returned with meat on a paper. She scrimped up 3 patties and put them on the grill. The smell of that arose was maddening. The gunslinger stood with solid indifference, only peripherally aware of the faltering piano, the slowing of the card game, and sidelong glances of the barflies. The man was halfway up behind him when the gunslinger saw him in the mirror. The man was almost completely bald, and his hand was wrapped around the haft of a gigantic hunting knife that was looped onto his belt like a holster. "Go sit down," the gunslinger said. "Do yourself a favor, cully." The man stopped, his upper lip lifted unconsciously, like a dog's, and there was a moment of silence. Then he went back to his table, and the atmosphere shifted back up again. Beer came up in the cracked glass schooner. "I ain't got no change for gold," the woman said truculently. "Don't expect any." She nodded angrily, as if this show of wealth, even at her benefit, incensed her. But she took his gold, and a moment later the hamburgers came up on a cloudy plate, still red around the edges. "Do you have salt?" She gave it to him in a little crook that she took from underneath the bar, white lumps that he'd have to crumble with his fingers. "Bread?" "No bread." He knew she was lying, but he also knew why, and didn't push it. The bald man was staring at him with cyanosed eyes, his hands clenching and unclenching on the splintered and gouged surface of the table. His nostrils flared and pulsating regularly, scooping up the smell of the meat. That, at least, was free. The gunslinger began to eat steadily, not seeming to taste, merely chopping the meat apart and forking it into his mouth, trying not to think of what cow this had come from and what must it had looked like. Threaded stock, he had said. Yes, quite likely, and pigs would dance the Kamala in the light of the peddler's moon. He was almost through, ready to call for another beer and roll a smoke, when the hand fell on his shoulder. He suddenly became aware that the room had once more gone silent, and that he tasted tension in the air. He turned around and stared into the face of the man who had been asleep by the door when he entered. It was a terrible face. The odor of the devil grass was a rank miasma. The eyes were damned, staring, glaring eyes of one who sees but does not see, eyes ever turning inward to the sterile hell of dreams beyond control, dreams unleashed, risen out of stinking swamps of the unconsciousness. The woman behind the bar made a small moaning sound. The cracked lip writhed, lifted, revealing the green, mossy teeth, and the gunslinger thought, he's not even smoking it anymore. He's chewing it. He's really chewing it. And on the heels of that, he's a dead man. Should have been dead a year ago. And on the heels of that, the man in black did this. They stared at each other, the gunslinger and the man who had gone around the rim of madness. He spoke, and the gunslinger, dumbfounded, heard himself addressed in the high speech of Gilead. "The gold for a favor, Gunslinger sigh. Just one? For a pretty?" The high speech. For a moment his mind refused to track it. It had been years, God, centuries, millennia. There was no more high speech. He was the last gunslinger. The others were all numbed. He reached into his breast pocket and produced a gold piece. The split, scrabbed, gangrenous hand reached for it, folded it, held it up, reflected to the greasy glare of the kerosene lamps. It threw off its proud civilized glow, golden, reddish, bloody. Ah! An inarticulate sound of pleasure. The old man did a wavering turn and began moving back to his table, holding the coin at eye level, turning it, flashing it. The room was emptying rapidly, the batwings shuttling madly back and forth. The piano player closed the lid of his instrument with a bang and exited after the others in a long comic opera strides. "Sheb!" The woman screamed after him, her voice an odd mixture of fear and screwishness. "Sheb, you come back here, goddammit!" Was that a name a gunslinger had heard before? He thought yes, but there was no time to reflect upon it now, or to cast his mind back. The old man, meanwhile, had gone back to his table. He had spun the gold piece onto the gouged wood, and the dead alive eyes followed it with empty fascination. He spun it a second time, a third, and his eyelids dropped. The fourth time, and his head settled on the wood before the coin stopped. "There," she said softly, furiously. "You've driven out of my trade. Are you satisfied?" "They'll be back," the gunslinger said. "Not tonight, they won't." "Who is he?" He gestured at the weed eater. "Go fuck yourself, Si." "I have to know," the gunslinger said patiently. He talked to you funny," she said. "Nort never talked like that in his life." "I'm looking for a man. You would know him." She stared at him, the anger dying. It was replaced with speculation, then with a high, wet gleam that he had seen before. The rickety building ticked thoughtfully to itself. A dog barked brayingly far away. The gunslinger waited. She saw his knowledge, and the gleam was replaced by hopelessness, by the dumb need that had no mouth. "I guess maybe you know my price," she said. "I got an itch I used to be able to take care of, but now I can't." He looked at her steadily. The scar would not show in the dark. Her body was lean enough so that the desert and the grit and the grind hadn't been able to sag everything. She'd once been pretty, maybe even beautiful. Not that it mattered. It would not have mattered if the grave beetles had nested in the aired blackness of her womb. It had been all written. Somewhere some had put it all down in Ka's book. Her hands had come up to her face, and there was still some juice left in her, enough to weep. "Don't look. You don't have to look at me so mean." "I'm sorry," the gunslinger said. "I didn't mean to be mean." "None of you mean it," she cried at him. "Close the place up and put out the lights." She wept, hands at her face. He was glad she had her hands at her face, not because of the scar, but because it gave her back her maidenhood, if not her maidenhead. The pin that held her strap of her dress glittered in the greasy light. Will he steal anything if I put him out if he will? No, she whispered. Don't steal. Then put out the lights. She would not remove her hands until she was behind him, and she doused the lamps one by one, turning down the wicks and breathing the flames into extinction. Then she took his hand into the dark, and it was warm. She led him upstairs. There was no light to hide their act. Thank you for watching part 3 of Majin reading the Gunslinger. I know it's been a while. I'm gonna try and keep up the schedule. I can't make any promises because my own schedule is pretty interesting. But it only takes 20 minutes a day, and besides, I can leave the computer on to make the rest of the work. So hopefully at least Majin reading I'll be able to do. Thank you guys, and hopefully, if nothing comes up, I'll see you tomorrow.